Jeremy Birmingham from LettermanRow.com joins us now. And Jeremy, to put it quite simply, this Saturday, Ohio State, Penn State, it's a college football playoff quarterfinal.
Yeah, I thought that the Ohio State-TCU game had that sort of same vibe for Ohio State because of the overall feel of the Big Ten right now. But this week in Happy Valley is almost certainly a play-in game for one of those two teams. I think the winner of this game obviously is in the driver's seat for the Big Ten Eastern Division, and that puts them in the position to make the playoff if they are able to win out. Obviously, they still have to go in and beat Michigan State, takes care of some other business, but this is a play-in game for sure.
Let's talk a little about Penn State. In a lot of ways, Ohio State and Penn State are kind of some mirror images of each other. Dynamic quarterback play, strong running game. Defensively, they've had some trouble stopping the run on both Ohio State and Penn State. Yeah,
I mean, I could see a 48-45 type game this weekend in Happy Valley, sort of a last team with the ball wins type of thing. Penn State obviously is a little bit more reliant on the quarterback run game, which is something Ohio State used to do, but obviously with Dwayne Haskins' emergence, Ohio State now is much more comfortable just throwing the ball down the field, whereas Trace McSorley is still read option, and then they're using Miles Sanders, who's a very talented running back. He's not Saquon Barkley, but he's a really good player, and Ohio State's going to have to watch out for him. And as you mentioned, both teams have struggled a little bit against the run. We watched as Illinois put up some good numbers against Penn State last Friday night. And I think in general, this is a team game where both sides are going to be looking and saying, how do we stop these guys? So to me, last team that has the ball probably wins.
When you look at the resumes of these two teams, I think it's fair to say that Ohio State has a best win than Penn State at this point.
Yeah, right now I think that Penn State is a team that has slowly sort of trying to find an identity. They struggled out of the gate, almost lost to Appalachian State. They struggled in the first half against Pitt. They struggled against Kent State. But they've started to look a little bit better, a little more comfortable, and a little bit more understanding of who they are without Saquon Barkley. And that's a tough adjustment for any team to have to make, because you're talking about how do we move on from the best offensive player in college football. But Trace McSorley, Urban Meyer on Monday called him a winner. It's the sort of the line that James Franklin has been echoing for the last few weeks. He just gets the job done, and I think that as long as he's in charge, the Buckeyes are going to have to watch into that backfield, and it really changes the whole dynamic of the game.
Urban Meyer talked about that a little bit on Monday, looking more at the Ohio State perspective. The fact that you've got Dwayne Haskins now, who's coming off of his third 300-yard performance in 4 games, is this Ohio State offense fundamentally different than what it was under J.T. Barrett?
No doubt about it. It's a totally different offense. Not only is it his third 300-game performance in 4 games, he's also thrown for 5 touchdowns in a half twice this year, which no Ohio State quarterback has ever done. And we've only seen just the sort of the top of the top, basically, of what I think Dwayne Haskins is able to do. He has played only a half in a handful of games. He's blowing away Troy Smith's pace from the 2006 National Championship contender game and Heisman Trophy winning season. And I think that just when you have a player like this, and you have wide receiver depth that Ohio State has, and you have receivers out of the backfield like J.K. Dobbins and Mike Weber, who are both very capable at catching the football, you have an opportunity to do things different. And I think, and again, we talked about it preseason, but this is the offense Ohio State wanted in 2015 when they had Cardale Jones as the starter, and we're expecting J.T. Barrett to sort of spell him the way that Tate Martell is doing now for Dwayne Haskins. But what you see is the evolution of an offense with veteran wide receivers, veteran offensive line, pass-catching running backs, and a quarterback that can hit anywhere on the field.
Let's talk about these wide receivers. It's the same 6 guys we've had for the last couple of years for Ohio State. Obviously, there's been a change at the wide receiver coach. Is Brian Hartline making that big of a difference, or is this just part of the maturation process of Johnny Dixon, Paris Campbell, Austin Mack, Terry McLaurin et al.?
I think that there's obviously an impact made by Brian Hartline. He's an NFL guy. He played 8 years in the NFL, played at Ohio State, understands the position. But your second point, to me, is more valid. We're looking at 4 receivers, especially with K.J. Hill, Johnny Dixon, Paris Campbell, and Terry McLaurin, that have been through it all at Ohio State, and what we're seeing from them is the evolution of their game. They're catching the ball with their hands, they're running better routes, they're getting open, and those guys are now sort of trickling down that attitude to Ben Victor and Austin Mack, and all these other players coming up say, hey, we got to block, we got to run hard every route, and they're being rewarded by having a quarterback, again, now that can get them the ball in places that they weren't able to get the ball the last few years. And I don't want to say that there were times when maybe they were surprised when it got where it was supposed to be, but now you expect it, and that changes your whole focus. And I think we've seen a real improvement in that room, but I don't think it's entirely based on the move from Zach Smith to Brian Hartline. I think Zach Smith did a fine job developing that group as young men, but obviously what Hartline brings on the field is totally different.
Oh, and it says a whole lot that those guys are your leaders, are your captains. You don't often see wide receivers as captains. We all know the stereotype of the prima donna wide receiver, but that's not the case for these Ohio State Buckeyes. Let's talk about the Tulane game. Obviously, first half was lights out, 6 drives, 6 touchdowns. In that first half, Ohio State was 3 for 4 on third down conversions. The one they didn't pick up, they picked up on a fourth down. What's more mind-boggling is in that entire first half, they only went to a third down 4 times. That's how efficient that offense was against Tulane.
Yeah, I mean, again, we could talk about Dwayne Haskins all day long. 21 of 24, 304 yards, 5 touchdowns. It's just very easy for him right now. And when you're playing a team like Tulane, there is a tendency, I think, for some folks to get a little bit complacent and not go out there and really put pedal to the metal. But the Buckeyes were not going to risk that. Urban Meyer's return to the sideline, I think they wanted to go out and really put on a show. They did that. And in doing so, we're able to have Dwayne, the entire offensive line, the starting receivers, Mike Weber, J.K. Dobbins off the field for the entire second half so that they could prepare for Penn State and not risk losing any other players to injury heading into the season's biggest game.
And in that second half, just the one touchdown came with just a minute left to go in the game, a little bit of a face-saving touchdown by Tate Martell. And if you watch the game on television, you kept on hearing, well, Ohio State's number 2s, Ohio State's number 2s. Those really weren't the Buckeye 2s, and those were the Buckeye 3s and 4s playing against Tulane in that second half. Yeah,
I mean, we had walk-ons all over the field. You had the 4th-string tailback in Master Teague, who's playing because Brian Snead is dealing with some disciplinary issues. You had Tate Martell running the show, but he's playing behind basically the 3rd-string offensive line, 3rd-string, 4th-string wide receivers. And with that, it was just a matter of let's get out of here, let's make sure nobody gets dinged up, and let's play it safe. And that's not exactly getting people their money's worth in the crowd, but the money is for Ohio State to play against Penn State and be healthy and to move forward with the season and not lose any more key parts.
Defensively, starting linebackers had 0 tackles against Tulane, a little bit of an anomaly of a statistic. In the fourth quarter, we did see Toledo's Dallas Gant play quite a bit, finished with 4 tackles, 3 on defense, 1 coming on special teams. First time we'd seen Dallas play at linebacker, and from everything we've heard for the last several months, he's impressing everybody with his maturity, with his athleticism, and we finally got to see that on display on the defensive side of the ball Saturday. Yeah, Dallas is a guy that the Ohio State coaching staff really likes. They feel that he's a player that can develop down the road into a big-time kid. I want to circle back to that first part of the first point you made, which is the starting linebackers had 0 tackles against a team that was essentially a triple option offense. That is shocking, but Dante Booker had a really nice game. Baron Browning, I think, played his best game coming off the bench as opposed to starting like he did in the first 2 games of the year. And then you saw Justin Hilliard and Dallas Gant and Taraja Mitchell and these other guys start to get some reps. And for Ohio State, there may be some value long term when you see Dante Booker, a 5th-year senior, and Justin Hilliard, a former 5-star linebacker, getting their opportunity and really taking advantage of it. Now, as far as Dallas goes, we talked about it a little bit off air, and I think that there's you can see the development in him being a more physical player, getting his head in the pile and making sure that he's cleaning up as opposed to avoiding contact, which he had a tendency to do at St. John's. And I think that ultimately it's going to prove down the road to be a really good thing for Dallas to get these reps now, and I think that we'll see a lot more of him as the Buckeyes get past Penn State. Other big story defensively, obviously, Ohio State without Robert Landers and Nick Bosa against Tulane. We saw the rest of the defensive line step up. It's going to be a whole different situation Saturday in Happy Valley. Nick Bosa will not be playing. We do expect Robert Landers to be back. Mike Weber should be back on the offensive side of things. Let's talk a little about this Nick Bosa situation. Urban Meyer on Monday saying he's going to be out a few more weeks, and then Nick Bosa's parents chiming in saying he won't be reevaluated until November. Ohio State gets past Penn State. They don't need Nick Bosa until November, but it's going to make for an interesting decision once Bosa gets to November if he's healthy enough. Sounds like he wants to come back and play for Ohio State, but what he potentially could have come next April, next May in the NFL draft, we're talking about potential a top 5, if not a number 1 pick. Is that a risk worth it for Nick Bosa to come back?
I think that question gets answered a lot more easily after Saturday night, to be honest. I think if the Buckeyes are able to go into Happy Valley and win that game without Nick, then as we said last week, you can sort of coast till November 10th against Michigan State and maybe not need him. But if the Buckeyes are undefeated heading into East Lansing and then undefeated heading home 2 weeks later to play Michigan, if Nick Bosa can play and the Buckeyes have a Big Ten title on the line, a chance to beat Michigan, a chance to make the college football playoff on the line, you bet your sweet Nick Bosa's playing. Yeah. Okay, he's not going to sit. Joey Bosa, 2015, sat in a bowl game that was could have sat in a bowl game that was meaningless and chose to play.
He got ejected for targeting.
Got ejected for targeting in the first quarter, but that doesn't matter. He wanted to play. These kids are really they want to play with their brothers and they want to go out there, and especially for a guy like Nick, the season that he was on his way to having was truly special. And if he has a chance to contribute to a college football playoff run and a possible national championship, he's not thinking about the NFL draft.
And, I mean, if he can come back in November, you're talking about potentially 6 to 7 games he could still play for Ohio State. So there's still quite a bit on the table if they take care of business against Penn State and they've got everything ahead of them, potentially a Big Ten championship game, potentially college football semifinal and a final. So it is going to be an interesting decision for Nick Bosa. Mike Weber, strained foot. Sounds like he's going to be able to go back against Penn State. Urban wasn't happy with the rushing attack against Tulane, partially because you didn't see J.K. Dobbins at all in the second half. As you mentioned, we didn't see Brian Snead either with the disciplinary issue, held Mike Weber out. The lack of a rushing attack against Tulane, how big of a concern is that?
Well, it's not that there was a lack of a rushing attack against Tulane that's a concern. It's the lack of a rushing attack against TCU and Rutgers and Tulane.
Well, I mean, Dobbins had 130-some against TCU.
Sure, but I mean, when you break it down and you're still only getting four yards of carry for Ohio State, that's not where you want to be. That's a program that is regularly.
We haven't seen the chunk yardage from the running backs.
We're not seeing that 6-7 yards a pop that the Buckeyes are used to, and I think that's the concern. The offensive line is huge. It is as big an offensive line as Ohio State's ever had. I'm not sure that they're really dominating at the point of attack right now in the running game, and I don't know if that's because they're so big. Maybe those guys are not able to move the way that some of the players in the past have been able to. Maybe they're not quite as able to get down and win at the point of attack. They're really great in pass pro. They're giving Dwayne Haskins a ton of time, but there may be a trade-off here. I think for Ohio State, the way that you continue to get better there is just by keeping that pass game open and making sure teams can't load the box, and then making sure that Mike Weber and J.K. Dobbins get to the first hole clean. If they do that, those two are good enough on their own to get those 10, 11 yards pretty much every play. But if they're getting hit at the line of scrimmage, they're not going to go far. These are not big guys. You're not talking about Alabama-type running back, 6'2", 230. We're talking 5'8", 5'9", 200-pound guys that need to get to that first hole untouched.
One last point about the Tulane game before we move on. Green Wave, you wouldn't expect that to be a very exciting game, but because it was Urban's return, there was a noticeable vibe around campus, around Ohio Stadium, and it ended up being a big recruiting weekend, a lot of kids coming in. Now, we're in a little bit of a period where there has been a whole lot of recruiting news, which from Ohio State's perspective, that's a little bit of good news because there was concern that you'd maybe lose a lot of kids with everything that happened in August and beginning of September. They only lost one commitment, but the recruiting stuff, we're also in that part of the year where that recruiting calendar is going to start to pick up a little bit now.
Well, August was the dead period, so you had to understand that Ohio State was not going to be doing much in August. Then you throw on the Urban Meyer mess on top of that, and all of a sudden you have a potential for a really disastrous month. It wasn't. The Buckeyes, as you said, lost just one commitment from a linebacker from Tennessee that was sort of a cherry on top of the class anyway. He wasn't a primary player in this group, but this past Saturday was huge for Ohio State. They brought in five of their commits were in town, including Harry Miller, the 5-star offensive center from Georgia. He came up to see Urban Meyer. And then the Buckeyes were able to bring in the country's top-ranked 2020 prospect, the state's best 2021 prospect, Jack Sawyer from Pickerington North, who is a 5-star prospect already. So they had a handful of really key players on campus. 4 of Michigan's best players in the 2020 class were in attendance, and a 2021 kid, Donovan Edwards, who they offered, and they're very high on his list, and vice versa. So we're going to see it start to pick up. Once the Buckeyes get back home for that Indiana game in 2 weeks, that's when official visits are going to start. We'll see some Ohio State commits coming up and taking their officials, and you'll see the Buckeyes really cranking up the energy as far as the recruiting atmosphere goes. But this past Saturday, it was about getting the most important players on campus, letting those guys celebrate with Urban, and in a way, letting Urban Meyer see that these guys are past it on their own and saying, hey, we're here for you, you're here for us, let's move this ship forward. And Ohio State is now in a position where they have the third-ranked recruiting class in the Big Ten, which is foreign to them. They've led the conference the last 7 years, but if they get 1 or 2 key commitments in the next few weeks or months, they'll jump Penn State and Michigan and be right back where they've been.
And football recruiting weekends are big for basketball as well. You've always seen Ohio State's basketball coaches bring recruits into the shoe as well. And this past weekend, we did see Maumee Valley Country Days' Zeb Jackson, class of 2020. He was at the shoe. Ohio State's one of the 7 teams he has listed as his finalists. And he's the number 2 rated prospect in the state of Ohio for 2020. Yeah,
and John Beeline from Michigan offered him last Thursday. Yep. The same day that Chris Holtman saw him work out. Today it was Michigan State and Butler visiting him. So it's in high gear right now for Zeb. And for the Buckeyes, it's an opportunity to keep another Toledo win at Ohio State. They really want to push that envelope and say, hey, look at the history of Toledo guys who go to Ohio State and how they fare. And that's why they're going at him big time. So, the Buckeyes are going to be in a position here in the next few days where they're going to find out on the 2019 class if they land E.J. Liddell from Illinois. He's a player that they feel very good about, and they could see a commitment from him this week. If they get that commitment, that'll be 3 top 40 players in the country committed to Ohio State for the class of 2019, and that's where that class will end. So you're talking about 2 players in Alonzo Gaffney and DJ Carton, the point guard from Iowa, who are top 25 5-star players, and then you have Liddell, top 40, and you're seeing a real momentum swing for Chris Holtman and the Buckeyes.
Back to football now. Ohio State, Penn State. Crazy things happen in this series. We saw it last year in Columbus. We saw it 2 years ago in Happy Valley. Urban Meyer at this point is saying he's not going to bring up Ohio State blowing a 4th quarter lead in Happy Valley 2 years ago, but that might be something they talk about later this week.
Well, it's kind of crazy when you look at it. The last 2 seasons, the road team has entered the 4th quarter with a 14-point lead and lost both times. Very out of character for Ohio State over the years, and it was certainly out of character for Penn State last year. But the atmosphere in Penn State is something that you can't prepare for. I don't care how loud you make it inside of the Woody Hayes Athletic Center this week. I don't care how many times you watch the 2016 or the 2014 games, which were both crazy games. Yes. 2014 came into double overtime and required Joey Bosa to sack 3 people at one time. Penn State, that atmosphere is not something you can replicate, and it's not something you find anywhere else in the Big Ten. I've been to Wisconsin at night. I've been to Ohio State at night. I've been everywhere around the league. Penn State is different. And so for me, what you really want to see out of Ohio State is to come out calm in that first quarter and not let things get away from you early, because with a team like Ohio State, it's still young. It's a young team. This is Dwayne Haskins' 5th start. Right. So he's never seen anything like this.
Well, he was in Ann Arbor in the 4th quarter, in the second half, trailing against Michigan. But at the same time, the sound of the Big House is not at all what the sound of Beaver Stadium is.
I'm going to, with all due respect to Michigan and Michigan fans, that stadium compared to what happens at Penn State at night is night and day, literally. It is not for the faint of heart.
It's a lot of its architecture as well. Because, Michigan is a bowl. They do have those suites now that does help bring some of that sound back in. But Beaver Stadium, that sound doesn't go anywhere. You're in a valley. You've got all the sound from that area of Pennsylvania just kind of concentrating on that stadium.
The whole thing is nuts. It's one of the worst places in America other than inside of that stadium at night watching the Penn State-Ohio State with the whiteout behind you. At this point, the weather looks like it should be okay on Saturday, so as long as that's in Ohio State's favor, I think that it's a little bit of an equalizer. But ultimately, this is going to come down to how Dwayne Haskins and the Ohio State offensive line handles that pressure and that noise.
2 weeks ago down in Texas, LettermanRow.com had some cool stuff with the alumni and the fans in Texas. Anything planned like that for this week with Penn State?
Not yet, but that's because there's nowhere to go in Happy Valley. We're going to be staying about an hour away, so there's not a lot of alumni groups in Bedford, PA. So I think that ultimately this comes down to we might see a 10 or 15 Buckeye fans. I know that in 2016, the Ohio State football players' parents were all very upset about how high up in the stadium they were. They don't treat visitors the same way in Happy Valley that they do at Jerry World.
We've had multiple Ohio State families tell us over the years that's one place they don't want to go back to for a whole lot of reasons. But Jeremy will go back to Happy Valley. I'll go back to Happy Valley. We'll have all the Happy Valley action for you coming up next week.